Hello and welcome back to my channel. If you've been following me for a while, you'll know that I posted my first video last year, today, my extended Zodiac dress, which I will link in the description, onto which I embroidered very many Zodiac signs. It's been an entire year, and I am still living my best Homestuck life, so I thought I would turn it into a sort of tradition for myself to make a dress for 4/13. This year I chose to draw my inspiration from the dress Rose wears when she goes grimdark, though I did take a few artistic liberties, mainly with the color. I drafted this pattern myself, made a mock-up, and fit that mock-up off camera to make sure it fit, though I stole the sleeves from another project. I made a few adjustments, including making the bodice quite a bit longer and added some seam allowance so that I would have a paper pattern to work off of, which you can see me doing here. As I said, I took some artistic liberties with this. I'm just personally not fond of turtle and mock necks, and this project was meant to be a touch fancier than her dress anyway, since it is a 4/13 gown. So I decided to interpret her turtleneck into a pointed Chelsea collar that contrasts with the bodice, which let me try out a new collar setting technique, and I decided on the shorter sleeves on her dress being fluttery little butterfly sleeves. The bodice has 6 panels, but not cut as princess seams, as I didn't want the dress to fit perfectly snugly, and I thought it would look cool. With the paper pieces cut out, I was ready to iron my fabric off screen, and then get started on actually cutting out the dress itself. This dress is made out of 2 fabrics. The first is a soft black semi-sheer cotton lawn that flows nicely on the outside, and then the other is a light orchid Kona cotton which has more body to it, which I put underneath. I chose to use the light orchid color because, first of all, Rose's text color is light orchid, but also because I couldn't find a hot pink, the same color as her dress, without using a polyester blend, and I try not to buy synthetic fabrics anymore for both ethical and comfort reasons. I knew that this dress was going to need to be hand washed. It was going to have sequin work on the front, and neither of these fabrics were particularly fray prone, so I decided to use flat lining and pinking shears for finishing work on this fabric when I couldn't use the pre-finished selvage edges. So I cut all my seams with pinking shears, which was so hard on the purple fabric for some reason. You can see me using 2 hands to cut the bodice pieces out, which made me feel the weakest I have ever felt in my life, but it just made my shears gum up really badly. They were so hard to open. I'm using a butterfly sleeve pattern out of a random paper pattern that I happen to have on hand. I think the pattern was for a Vogue dress, but I don't remember which one. And the long sleeves I stole from one of my Halloween dresses. It was meant to have a cuff attached, but I didn't want that for Rose's dress, so I just cut it to be as long as I possibly could using the width of the cotton so that I wouldn't have to worry about running out. Which still didn't work, so not only are the sleeves slightly too short on the finished dress, but I also couldn't pull them up to my elbows, which, as a bicon, was incredibly frustrating. To have some gathering at the waist, but not a ton of volume, So my solution to this problem was to have the thinner, drapier cotton lawn gathered in a rectangle skirt. I used the 2 panels of the fabric's full 53-inch width for that, and used a more flared skirt for the heftier orchid fabric to avoid that bulk. In this case, I used the half-circle skirt was as long as I possibly could manage with the width of the fabric, so it was 36 inches long after my waist was cut, and I cut the back fabric 39 inches so that I could have a fairly wide hem still, and have the black fabric still be hiding the orchid beneath it. Cut out a circle skirt or a half circle skirt, make sure you let it hang overnight, as part of it is cut on the fabric's diagonal grain line, and thus will be prone to stretching and warping, which is great if you're making a pretty vintage bias cut slip, but not so nice if you are like me and forget and have to rehem your whole garment because the underskirt is now peeking out from beneath the hem of the overskirt. With all my pieces finally cut out, I could get started on the actual assembly. I'm using a technique called flatlining to assemble the bodice, which is essentially stacking your outer fabric and your inner fabric, now considered your lining, together, and from then on treating them as one piece of fabric. It was a very common technique for finishing garments up until at least the 60s, and the added body of the 2 fabrics together makes it very easy to sculpt a smooth shape on the human body that isn't prone to wrinkling and clinging. Next, we have a bit of an order of assembly problem. After I have all of my pieces matched, I can assemble the front panel and the back panels separately, and sew the collar pieces against one another so that I can trim them, turn them inside out, press all of my seams, and then do up the shoulder seams. Doing up the shoulder seams before the side seams allows you to install the collar while the bodice is still flat and you don't have to fight against the curvature of the completed garment. And it's a double bonus while you're doing understitching and sewing the seam allowances of the collar to the inside of the garment to prevent them from flipping outwards, although in this case I did end up sewing on some bias tape facing to them anyway, because the point in the center was ugly and I didn't like looking at it. I also sewed up my vertical seams on my sleeves at this point because while I was at the sewing machine I might as well do that. collar, I sewed each side separately onto the outside of the bodice, making sure to get the front corners to fit as closely together as possible so that there wouldn't be a noticeable gap between the two pieces, as I could finagle the back to have the collar and the zipper hide any empty space there, but there's not that option at the front. And I did that thing where you press and sew the seam allowance down to the outside so that they wouldn't be visible when the garment was worn. Collar assembled, I was able to do up the side seams and start thinking about the rest of the assembly. Both of these sleeves had to be gathered down separately to fit the arm sky or armhole because they were from two different patterns. I used my normal method of gathering running stitches by pinning the bottom half and then easing the gathered portion to fit the rest of the arm sky. I've never had any problems with standard sleeve settings like this because I use the super easy method of turn the bodice and sleeve right side out and then line up the side seam with the vertical seam of the sleeve. Although this time it was a bit confusing because my brain kept telling me to put the butterfly sleeve on the inside for no reason, which was wrong. And I did have to pleat my long sleeve down a bit because the pattern had a slightly different size arm sky than the one that the sleeve was drafted for, and I wasn't expecting it to be such a difference that I would have to do that. With the sleeves and the collar installed, I now had a full bodice ready for a zipper and a skirt. I said before I used 2 panels of the black fabric, so I just sewed those 2 panels together using the selvage edge. The selvage is a pre-finished edge at either side of the fabric when the fabric is made. It doesn't fray, it's pre-finished, so I took advantage of that to just stick them together and have a very minimal effort seam at the center front. Then I ran 2 lines of very long stitches across what I decided would be the top edge. These stitches are used for gathering the fabric. You pick one side of both threads to pull on, and then you can gently ease the fabric towards the center of the panel to make it gather up to whatever length you want. In this case, it was my waist measurement. I cut out my half-circle skirt all in one piece with selvage edges, so I didn't have to do any sewing to put that together. No, this dress does not have pockets. Yes, I know that's a minor sin, but I don't plan on wearing this anywhere but cons, where I will have my enormous bag of supplies for literally anything I can think of, from sewing emergencies to prop failures to blood sugar crashes, so I'm really not that concerned. So once I had my black fabric gathered down to roughly the correct length, I was able to just pin it on and start easing to make sure that my gathers were spaced out evenly. It wasn't gathered too close to the ends. Nothing was getting pinned where I would run over non-seam parts of my panel with my sewing machine, and that it was the right size. It's not hard, just a little finicky to do this. With that, it's really starting to look like a dress. I picked a black 22-inch invisible zipper for this project, and getting them in the right way, I'm a simple man. Like with my sleeve setting, I just turn it right side out, do up the zip, and then turn over that center back seam and pin it, and use that as a guide after I unzip. I don't really have any big advice for installing them either, other than to purchase the machine foot specifically for them, and to make sure you're ironing them out flat on your iron's polyester setting before you try and install them. That really does help. You can hand sew them in sloppily or baste as a try-on for them if you really want them not to shift around, but I only use that on slippery fabrics now, and neither of these are very slippery. It was at this moment that I realized that I wouldn't be able to have these two layers free-floating from each other, which I had intended to do in order to improve its spinniness. The way I did the bodice meant that I would have had to tear out and reinstall the zipper, and then tear off part of the bodice pieces from the skirt and reinstall the zipper in a really weird way, which included that disassembly process, and I was worried that you were going to be able to see the seam allowance around the zipper that way through that semi-sheer black fabric. So I just bit the bullet and accepted that I was going to have to hem these pieces and then do up the back seam separately, which is why I got flustered and forgot to let it hang overnight. Black lace hem tape on the orchid fabric, which looks pretty cool if I do say so myself, and also prevents that hemline from doing any fraying without me having to put a ton of effort into a double rolled hem, probably done by hand, on a circle skirt, which is hell, because you're trying to fit a large circle inside of a smaller circle. For the back fabric, though, I just used a standard double rolled hem that was long enough to prevent that orchid fabric from peeking out. Or so I thought. The hem of the long sleeves while I was at it. My machine was already loaded up with the orchid thread and I already had the lace tape out, so I pinned those on and sewed them, though I didn't include the actual sewing footage with that bit, because you couldn't see anything anyway since it barely fit under the machine's foot. pieces hemmed separately, and a little uneven as a result, I was able to do up the center back seam, first time at least, and then the dress was actually wearable except for the hem on the little butterfly sleeves, which you'll see me turn in twice. A very narrow double-rolled hem for maximum floatiness, and sew down in just a minute. The belt was a bit of a struggle. I was out of fusible interfacing, and so was my local Walmart. I didn't realize that my local Joann's was still open for curbside pickup, because the internet just said it was closed, and I was socially distancing because of the coronavirus, so all I had to reinforce the belt was some very bulky sew-in interfacing. I cut out 2 strips of the purple fabric and the interfacing the size of my waist, one for the belt itself, and one to construct the loops of the bow, and cut another longer piece for the tails of it. Even with the sew-in interfacing trimmed down after it was sewn to practically nothing on the allowance, it was still too hefty for me to mow over with my sewing machine, so I trimmed it and used a piece of that to fold in the edges and press for the center of the bow. Then I just kind of did my best to glue the bow together at one end of the belt. It's not the best, but it sure is a bow, I suppose. For the ends of the belt itself, I used a few ribbon loops and a set of 3 cute little rose buttons, which I sewed on off camera after waiting for the glue to cure. It's not a perfect solution, and one of the buttons is visible when the belt is worn, so I will probably rip them off and sew some hooks and eyes on there that won't be so visible when the belt is worn. At some point, but not right now because I'm a little sick of this project. Final step, the squiddle on the front. I love this little guy. I drew him on freehand with some chalk and sewed him on with some sequins that the camera absolutely does not do any justice because they shine like teal and purple, like kinda opalescent, which absolutely matches the aesthetic of this costume. But I just sewed those on by hand while on a Zoom call with my girlfriend because it's 2020 and all of life takes place on Zoom now. Overall, I love this project. It's not absolutely perfect, and I really should have done the hem right the first time, but it fits just the way I wanted it to, and it's so comfortable, aside from those long sleeves that I can't pull up. My local con will absolutely be visited in this next year, and since that's always in March, it'll be warmer than my last dress in the early Western New York spring. And don't worry about me for the photo shoot, it was appropriately socially distanced. And I absolutely forgot to take off my car key lanyard, which is why you can see that in a few shots. We both have inattentive ADHD, so we notice absolutely nothing. If you're feeling the nostalgia listening to this music, this is off one of the retired Homestuck albums, 1 Year Older by Eric Sheila. Thank you to Eric for letting me use it. It is available in the description box below, and Eric is totally cool with everyone downloading it for free off his Bandcamp. Thank you guys for watching. Like this video, subscribe if you want to see more sewing from me, and consider joining my Discord if you want to show off your own creations. Not just sewing related stuff, but we accept all kinds of artwork and crafty stuff, and sometimes I post extremely specific crafter memes.